He was arrested for doing nothing wrong, but the arrest of former Justice Elijah C.K. Kirby sparked a legal storm. From courtroom drama to federal investigations, his story became a turning point for justice in America. Will the truth prevail? Boston, Massachusetts. A quiet winter night. Snow drifted lightly across the cobblestone street, catching the warm glow of golden lamps that lined Beacon Street, a place where even the bricks seemed to know which social class they belonged to. Elijah C.K. Kirby, 76 years old, stood silently outside Wellington Row, an upscale restaurant so exclusive it required reservations a month in advance just to dine. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. As a retired U.S. federal judge, he understood the value of waiting. In his hand, he held a weathered fedora. On his fingers, worn black leather gloves, cracked gently by time. His charcoal wool overcoat was pressed to perfection, shoes polished with care. Everything about him understated but elegant, just like the man himself. Elijah had arrived early to meet his granddaughter, Maya, a third-year law student at Harvard, who was inside dining with friends. He simply wanted a few quiet minutes to breathe in the cold air, to feel the stillness, and reflect on a life well lived, on courtrooms, rulings, and the many times he had to wrestle, not just with the law, but with the deep-rooted prejudice in the very seats meant to serve justice. Across the street, a police cruiser sat parked. Inside, Officer Travis Hensley, 32, buzz-cut and sharp-eyed, chewed gum and watched the black man standing in front of the restaurant. Next to him sat Darren Moxley, 41, more seasoned, his eyes thinly veiling a look of contempt. Another vagrant hoping to hit up the rich for money, Travis muttered, revving the engine slightly before slamming the parking brake with finality. Don't let him hang out too long, Moxley said, voice flat but loaded. We don't want to upset the VIPs. Elijah heard the patrol car door open behind him. He didn't turn around, not yet. Part of him still believed he lived in a country that had changed, at least on paper. But then the voice came, dry and full authority. Sir, we'd had complaints about a black male loitering outside this restaurant. I need you to leave the premises immediately. Elijah turned, his gaze calm. I'm waiting for my granddaughter. She's dining inside. Travis sneered. Your granddaughter? In that restaurant? You got any ID, old man? Elijah slowly reached into his coat. I can show. But before he could retrieve his wallet, Travis slapped a hand hard on his shoulder, spinning him around. We don't need to see anything. We need you gone. The cold no longer came from the weather. It came from power misused. On the pavement below, Elijah's black leather wallet slipped from his coat and fell open. A small blue card tumbled out, barely visible under the street lamp. It read, Justice Elijah C.K. Kirby, U.S. Federal Court Red. But no one bothered to pick it up. Elijah was shoved into back of the squad car, and the Boston night rolled on as if nothing wrong had just happened. Inside the cruiser, the crackle of the police radio struggled to cut through the low chuckle of Officer Travis Hensley. Elijah sat still, hands resting on his knees, cold steel cuffs biting at his wrists. He didn't speak. He simply stared out the window, watching the city lights blur behind a veil of fog. Darren Moxley glanced into the rear-view mirror. You're awful calm, he said, half mocking, half curious. Most folks like you are yelling, crying, demanding a lawyer, but you just sit there. Travis snorted. Old man probably knows a night in the precinct means cold concrete and no blanket, he said, laughing in the way of someone who thought he held all the power. Elijah slowly turned his head, unhurried, deliberate. His eyes, though heavy with age, still held a clarity that neither man expected. You're making a serious mistake, he said. The words weren't loud. There was no anger behind them, but they sliced the cruiser like a blade gliding through thin skin, too soft to notice, too sharp to ignore. Travis raised a brow. Oh yeah? What mistake would that be? Elijah's voice remained steady, almost like he was lecturing in a library. You think you know who I am, he said, but you don't know anything. And when you do, it'll be too late. Darren squinted, eyeing his partner. Is he threatening us? Let him talk. Old men love to ramble. Travis shrugged, then pressed the gas pedal, steering the car toward District 17 police station. Elijah leaned back, closing his eyes. not from fatigue, but from reflection. He remembered something important. Silence is always the first strategy of those who understand the true weight of their words. He'd spent decades on the bench. He had watched men with power crumble because they failed to understand the difference between authority and legitimacy. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to beg to be heard. Because when the moment came, no one would be able to ignore the name. Justice Elijah C.K. Kirby. The car turned onto Tremont Street, its tires kicking up a splash from a shallow puddle, streaking grime across the windshield. Darren reached up and flicked on the interior dome light. The dim glow cast over Elijah's face, a face that once appeared in law textbooks, televised hearings, and congressional panels. But to them, he was just an old black man who didn't know his place. "You think we're going to let you go because you talk pretty and wax philosophical?" Travis laughed, shaking his head. "Let me tell you something. Old man, around here we're the law." Elijah opened his eyes and looked straight at them. Through them, his gaze was not confrontational, but it was impossible to look away from. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not threatening you. I'm just telling the truth." Darren squinted again. There was something in Elijah's tone, measured, unshaken, that made them less sure of themselves than they had been just minutes before. It was a feeling they couldn't name, but it felt like the night had begun to change. The holding cell in District 17 Police Station smelled of time, a mixture of rusted metal and faint mildew clinging to the mottled brick walls. Elijah C.K. Kirby sat on the cold steel bench, no longer handcuffed, but the red marks on his wrist still lingered, a quiet reminder of the welcome he'd received. Travis Hensley and Darren Moxley had left him there without even filing charges, at least not yet. They figured the old man would sit for a few hours, cool off, then be let go without a single word of apology. Elijah glanced at the wall-mounted phone at the end of the hallway. "I'd like to make a call," he said clearly, voice raspy but firm. The desk officer barely looked up. "One call. No video, no FaceTime. Local numbers only." Elijah nodded slowly. "I just need a direct line." He stepped forward, picked up the handset, and dialed. His fingers moved with calm precision, not trembling, not rushed, like they had dialed this number 100 times before. The line rang once, twice, then a voice answered. "Office of Chief Justice Alcott. This is Rebecca." "Rebecca," Elijah said, a faint smile forming at the corners of his mouth. "Tell Chief Justice Raymond Alcott that an old friend's having some trouble at a precinct, and it's going to make the news." There was a pause on the other end. Then Rebecca's voice dropped, suddenly alert. "Hold, please." It didn't take 30 seconds. The next voice was deep, commanding, and instantly familiar. "Elijah?" "Hello, Raymond," he replied, like the two had merely paused their morning tea. "Jesus Christ? Where are you?" Raymond's voice shifted from surprise to alarm. "My niece called me in the middle of a session. She said I needed to hear from you immediately." "What happened?" Elijah leaned back against the wall, eyes fixed on the desk officer, chewing gum like nothing was out of the ordinary. "I'm being held at District 17, picked up outside Wellington Row. No ID check, no explanation. They didn't ask my name. They didn't care who I was." There was a sharp exhale on the other end. They arrested you without checking ID?" "No, Raymond. They just saw an old black man standing outside a luxury restaurant." A thud echoed through the phone, someone slamming a desk. Raymond was no longer just an old classmate. He was now the highest judicial authority in the United States, and he was livid. "Elijah," his voice now low and steely, "I'm calling the Attorney General right now. By morning, before they could even burn the shift logs, this will be in the hands of the federal court. They have no idea who they just touched." Elijah gave a slight nod, even though he knew the person on the other end couldn't see it. "I'm still here, but not for long." He placed the receiver down, then turned back to the bench, sitting once more with the quiet composure of a man who had just awakened an earthquake. The desk officer glanced at him through the glass. "Get hold of your lawyer yet?" Elijah gave a faint smile. "No, I just called the man who writes the law." The glass doors of District 17 Police Station swung open with a sharp click. The click of heels on marble echoed through the lobby, sharp, precise, like the beat of a war drum. Maya Kirby strode in, dressed in a tailored black suit, carrying a red folder stamped urgent. Her hair was tied in a sleek bun and her gaze was icy. But what truly froze the room was the man walking beside her. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jonathan Myers. The desk sergeant straightened instinctively, hands suspended mid-reach for his coffee. The air in the room thickened, tense, unmoving. "I'm Maya Kirby," she announced clearly, civil rights attorney with the National Civil Liberty Oversight Council. "And this is Mr. Jonathan Myers, representative of the U.S. Attorney's Office." The officer behind the counter swallowed hard. What can I do for you?" "We're here to request the immediate release of Mr. Elijah C.K. Kirby," Jonathan said, his voice low and sharp as a blade. Per direct statement from Chief Justice Raymond Alcott, his detainment is unconstitutional and a gross violation of civil liberties. Across the room, a series of keyboard clacks echoed as computer screens went dark. The smug faces from earlier turned to stone. Maya stepped forward, her eyes flicking to the nameplate on the officer's chest. "Lieutenant Keller, I need to speak to your commanding officer. Now." "Captain Trent is in his office," Keller stammered, then quickly spun around and rushed down the hallway. At that moment, a young officer emerged from the cell block. It was Officer Logan Bell, the youngest on shift. He saw Maya and Jonathan, blinking rapidly. But instead of retreating, Bell stepped closer, his face tight with tension. "I'm sorry, I have to say this," he said softly. "When I walked past the holding cell, Mr. Kirby, he introduced himself. I thought he was joking, but he wasn't afraid. He just sat there like he was waiting for court." Maya locked eyes with Bell, then nodded. "Thank you for your honesty. You'll be speaking again under oath." Just then, the command office door burst open. Captain Gerald Trent appeared, phone still in hand, his face ashen and his hand trembling. "Ms. Kirby, AUSA Myers, I just got off the phone with the Attorney General's office. We will bring Mr. Kirby out right away." "No," Maya said, her voice low but diamond hard. "He doesn't need to be brought out. He'll walk out on his own." The entire room fell silent, and then the iron door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Elijah Kirby, still composed, clad in his tailored gray overcoat, gazed calm and steady, walked out as if he were presiding over the hearing himself. All eyes turned to him, but no one laughed. There was no longer any disdain, only a growing sense of fear. And that was the moment everything began to shift. The atmosphere inside District 17 Police Station now resembled a live grenade with the pin pulled. The whispers vanished. The clatter of keyboards fell silent. Officers near the holding cell instinctively stepped back as Elijah C.K. Kirby slowly made his way down the corridor, hands tucked into his coat pockets, face eerily serene. Captain Gerald Trent could no longer maintain his air of authority. He swallowed hard, stammering, You really?" "Elijah Kirby," the man replied. "Former U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Retired 2009. And it seems I'm the only person in this building who still remembers the Constitution is in effect." The word struck like thunder. Behind the front desk, Lieutenant Keller fumbled and dropped a folder. A young female officer slowly pulled off her headset, looking around like someone just waking from a trance. Jonathan Myers gave a dry, cutting smile. No one thought to check his ID. No one answered. Officer Logan Bell swallowed visibly. He was the only one brave enough to speak. I wasn't given any ID. They just said, "Old guy loitering outside the restaurant." You thought wrong," Maya Kirby interrupted, her gaze never leaving Captain Trent. "And because of that mistake, you've now watched an entire precinct spiral into crisis." Right then, the phones began to ring. 1, 2, 3, 4. Landlines, cell phones, even the fax machine, all going off like alarms in a haunted house. Nearby officers jolted in place. "Call from the Department of Justice," someone yelled. "CNN is broadcasting live. What is this?" All of Washington knows. "Main lines jammed," a voice shrieked from the tech room. Captain Trent stood frozen, staring at Elijah, not with authority, but with dread. The dread of a man who just realized the chair he's been sitting on all these years was actually a minefield. Elijah stepped gently toward the reception desk. He said nothing. He picked up his old leather wallet, which had been discarded carelessly near the intake log. He reached inside and pulled out a single card. He held it out to Trent. "Can you read this?" Trent took the card with trembling hands. His eyes skimmed the embossed gold letters. Justice Elijah C.K. Kirby, United States Supreme Court retired. His hand trembled. The ID card fell to the floor like a verdict. No one around him seemed to be breathing. They weren't just terrified because they had detained the wrong person. They were paralyzed by the realization that they had humiliated, suppressed, and disrespected a symbol of American justice. Lieutenant Gerald Trent stood frozen in the middle of the intake room. His face drained of all color as confirmation of Elijah C.K. Kirby's true identity echoed through the room. A chill swept through, as if the heating system had suddenly shut down. Every gaze, from the front desk clerks to the officers lining the hallway, locked onto Gerald Trent. No one spoke. The illusion of absolute power they had grown used to had cracked wide open. Then the front door creaked open again. Officers Travis Hensley and Darren Moxley walked in from patrol, trying to keep their tone casual. Heard someone from DOJ was, "Don't speak, Travis." Trent snapped, every syllable sharp. "Say nothing." But it was too late. Jonathan Myers, federal prosecutor's office representative, was already standing at the entrance. His eyes were cold steel, and his voice rang out like thunder in the stunned silence. "Officer Hensley, Officer Moxley, you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately." Moxley froze like a man turned to stone. Travis's face flushed red, fists clenched at his sides. "All this or that? I was just following protocol." "No!" Jonathan cut in, stepping forward with precision. "You followed instinct, not the law. And your instinct was to dismiss a black man in an overcoat standing outside a restaurant." Maya Kirby remained silent beside her grandfather, her expression unreadable. Elijah, as calm as ever, sat in the interview room with his hands gently resting on his knees. He didn't need to speak. Everything that mattered had already been revealed. A phone rang. Captain Trent stepped over to answer it. His face turned ghost white within seconds. He put the receiver down slowly, his hand trembling. "That was the Department of the Interior," he said, voice barely audible. "They're demanding access to all complaint files against Hensley and Moxley from the past 10 years. Jonathan Myers nodded, unsurprised. What was once buried will now be unearthed. "I strongly suggest cooperation, unless you're ready to face federal charges." Travis looked around, his eyes twitching as he noticed all his fellow officers avoiding eye contact. Darren Moxley stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped. They both knew this wasn't just a temporary fall. This was collapse. And in that quiet room, the only sound left was a pen scratching across suspension papers. An era of untouchability had just ended, and it all began because they assumed an elderly black man couldn't possibly matter. After Hensley and Moxley's suspension, District 17 fell into chaos. Calls from the Department of Justice and the Department of the Interior flooded in, demanding access to decades of disciplinary records. A full-blown investigation was launched, not only into 2 officers, but into the entire department. Meanwhile, Elijah C.K. Kirby became the center of national media attention. Major outlets like CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times all ran headline stories, hailing him as a living symbol of intellectual resistance and unshakable resolve. Interviews, op-eds, and special features aired continuously, sparking nationwide debate on systemic racism and abuse of power within the justice system. A major turning point came when a leaked surveillance video from inside the police station surfaced. In the video, Captain Gerald Trent was seen instructing subordinates to handle incidents involving people of color quickly and quietly in order to protect the station's image. The footage triggered public outrage, leading to Trent's suspension and placement under special federal investigation. But the probe didn't stop with District 17. Other precincts across Boston were ordered to review disciplinary records and operational protocols. Several high-ranking officers were exposed for covering up misconduct, resulting in a wave of suspensions and forced resignations. In the midst of this reckoning, Elijah Kirby was invited to testify before a special hearing in the United States Congress on justice reform. Standing before the nation's lawmakers, he said, "Silence is not weakness. It's waiting for the right moment to speak. And when we speak, let that voice carry truth and justice." His speech received a standing ovation, becoming a rallying cry for civil rights advocates across the country. In Courtroom 3 at the Boston Federal Courthouse, not a single seat was empty. The chandelier's light reflected off the high ceilings, casting a solemn glow over the packed room. Outside, hundreds gathered, holding signs in hope for a fair verdict. Elijah C.K. Kirby took the witness stand, composed, sharp-eyed. He wore a light gray suit with a navy blue tie, the colors of integrity and resolve. Across the room, Travis Hensley and Darren Moxley sat silently, faces tight, eyes downcast. Federal Prosecutor Bryce Langston rose, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Justice Kirby, can you recount what happened that day?" Elijah nodded, his voice low but unwavering. "I was waiting for my granddaughter outside a restaurant. I did nothing wrong, and yet I was arrested, treated like a criminal, solely because of the color of my skin." The courtroom fell silent. One juror wiped away tears. Behind them, Maya Kirby gripped her hands tightly, eyes burning. Bryce continued, "Did you resist?" "No. I knew the truth would speak for itself." Suddenly, Assistant Federal Prosecutor Jonathan Myers stepped forward and submitted a new piece of evidence: surveillance footage from a restaurant across the street, obtained via an expanded warrant. The footage revealed Hensley and Moxley laughing, using racial slurs to describe Elijah, mocking his presence outside the upscale venue. The room was stunned. Judge Dolores Vance immediately ordered a recess to review the new evidence. After the break, the trial resumed. The 12-member, multi-ethnic jury exchanged determined glances. After 3 hours of deliberation, they returned to the courtroom. Presiding Judge Vance asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor. For the defendant, Travis Hensley, what is your finding?" "Guilty." For the defendant, Darren Moxley? "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Outside, cheers roared through the streets. Elijah closed his eyes, exhaling in relief. Maya threw her arms around him. Judge Vance announced the sentence. For the crime of violating civil rights, defendant Hensley is sentenced to 12 years in prison. Defendant Moxley is sentenced to 10 years in prison. No parole. The trial had ended, but its impact rippled across America. Elijah Kirby became a symbol of justice and quiet defiance. His story began to appear in law school curricula nationwide, serving as a solemn reminder. Justice may be slow, but it never fails to arrive. But the legal reckoning didn't stop there. Just 3 days later, a special hearing was convened for Captain Gerald Trent. Before a federal court, the leaked internal surveillance footage, showing him instructing officers to quietly handle cases involving black citizens to preserve the station's image, was played publicly. Trent's eyes darted in panic as the clip played. His defense of internal protocols couldn't save him from the nationwide outrage. This time, Trent wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one being charged. The news of Elijah Kirby's trial swept across the United States like a tidal wave crashing into a fortified wall labeled the Old Order. In less than 2 weeks, over a dozen police departments in different states were placed under federal review. Sealed records, complaints, missing reports, suppressed videos were now being forced into the light. The media coined the term, the Kirby effect. A simple phrase, but one that carried the force of a nationwide reckoning. In Denver, an entire precinct was dismantled after uncovering 23 cases of systemic misconduct. In Atlanta, over 17 officers were suspended in a single morning. In Chicago, an independent commission for police reform was created. For the first time in city history, Elijah did not stand before cameras. He declined all interviews, all television invitations. Instead, he issued one short written statement. "I didn't win because of who I am. I won because I refused to bow to what was wrong. And if what I endure can force the system to reckon with itself, then I would do it again, even at 80 years old. Law schools began integrating the case into their constitutional and civil rights curricula. High school students in Richmond named their new activist group after Elijah, and those who once believed they had no voice, people like him, now walked into town hall meetings with heads held high, knowing they were no longer alone. The lesson from Elijah Kirby's story wasn't about fame. It was about the reach of quiet integrity. One person, one action, but enough to shake a system long resistant to change. 3 weeks after the trial, inside the Grand Auditorium at Boston University, a special forum was held under the theme, Justice Never Sleeps. On stage sat Elijah C.K. Kirby, no longer the man wrongly handcuffed on a winter night, but now a living symbol of intellectual resistance and calm defiance. In front of him were hundreds of students, attorneys, and civil rights advocates. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. True power, Elijah said, his voice low and steady, doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one patient enough to listen, observe, and strike at the right time. The auditorium fell silent, then erupted into thunderous applause. At the very same moment, an official release from the Department of Justice made headlines. Captain Gerald Trent, who had once ordered officers to quietly suppress cases involving black citizens, was formally indicted for abuse of power and obstruction of internal procedure. The leaked internal footage was no longer just an ethical embarrassment. It had become the legal blow that forced the system to reckon with itself. Elijah's story didn't end in a courtroom. It echoed far beyond it. A wake-up call to anyone who believed that power could be used to silence without consequence. He didn't return for revenge. He returned as a force to restore justice, not with rage, but with unshakable resolve. And he did not walk alone.